Hey, welcome family to My Irreligious Life podcast with your host Jermaine Thomas, aka The Professor. Deconstructing and deconverting from your faith is a very difficult journey. The process can have psychological and emotional implications. Join us as we have a heartwarming and engaging dialogue around this and so much more. Let's get it, family.
I'm Dr. Robin DiAngelo, and my work focuses on the question of what does it mean to be white in a society that proclaims race meaningless, yet is profoundly separated by race. And to start this off, I want to draw your attention to the fact that I'm white. So just look at me for a moment, think about it, notice it. And part of being white is that it's a very uncomfortable thing for me to do. And it's taken me many, many years to be able to draw people's attention to my race and see any significance in it. And that's because as a white person, I was socialized to see race as what they had. I was just a person. I was just a white bread, a Heinz 57. I didn't have race. I was socialized to see race as individual acts of discrimination and prejudice, individual acts that anybody could do to anybody else, and if you did those acts, you were a bad person. And that is why, since I saw myself as a good person, I didn't see myself as connected to racism, and certainly didn't see myself as connected to race. In other words, I didn't have a sense of a racial identity. Today, I understand that I move through the world always and most particularly as a white person. I have a white frame of reference, and I have a white experience. And part of being white is to have that be invisible to us and to be able to live our lives without ever acknowledging that, to see that as non-operative. I now understand racism as a system, as a deeply embedded system, a system that our country was founded on and that all our institutions were created out of. And every institution reinforces this system. And it's a system of unequal power. So let me give you an example. Women in the United States got the right to vote in 1920. And there was only one possible way that we could have gotten the right to vote, and that was for men to give it to us, because we literally were not sitting in the seats of institutional power. We could not give ourselves the right to vote. That doesn't mean that we couldn't have personal power, but we didn't have institutional power. And that's the difference between a system and individual acts. Prior to women's suffrage, I could certainly discriminate against men. I could be unfair to individual men, but my group could not systematically deny men as a group the right to vote. And men controlled all the institutions, and they all worked together to convey the message that women's place was here and men's place was there. And that's the difference between individual prejudice and a system of inequality. So in this field, we think about oppression, or in this case racism, as group prejudice backed by institutional power. And so prior to the civil rights movement, it was fairly socially acceptable for white people to just come out and say, we are superior. My father certainly was comfortable saying that. The great joke of Archie Bunker and all of the family was that he wasn't up with the times and he was still saying things that conveyed this idea. But post-civil rights, it became bad to be racist, right? It became unacceptable to be racist. And that seems like a positive thing, right? Racism's bad. But unfortunately, what it morphed into is to make it impossible for white people to look at racism, because what we hear is, I would have to be a bad person in order to perpetuate racism. It became a moral issue. In addition to years of reflection and study of my own racial identity and how it shapes my life and my experience and my perspectives, I've had the very rare opportunity to, for a living, day in and day out, lead primarily white groups of people in discussions of race and racism. And there are some very, very predictable patterns that come up in these conversations. And as I listen to these, it's almost like a script, right? That, like, it's almost as if, as white folks, we just pick up this script and we say the same things again and again and again. And as a sociologist, rather than seeing something that's patterned as meaning therefore it's true, I look at something patterned as very revealing of how we get socialized to see things and to see the world. And then the next question that follows that is, and so how does that function? Right? And when we look around us, we can see that although we have changes since the civil rights movement and we have this idea of racism being bad, we still have the same unequal outcomes by race. By every measure, we have racial inequality. So how do we have such different narratives than we had prior to the civil rights movement and still have unequal outcomes? And as I listen to white folks, my group, repeat these narratives over and over, I got this image of a dock, like a pier, and it's just floating on the water, and that's all the superficial things that we say. And you probably recognize some of these, you hear them, maybe you've said them yourself. I don't see color. I was taught to treat everybody the same. I don't care if you're pink, blue, purple, polka dotted. My parents weren't racist, that's why I'm not racist. Or my parents were racist, that's why I'm not racist. It doesn't really matter what goes in front of it. The answer is always, I'm not racist. I know people of color. I used to work in the military. All of the things we say to rationalize that we ourselves are not complicit in this system. Now, I want to speak to two of these before I kind of take us below the surface of the dock. And one is this idea that our parents taught us to treat everyone the same. And I am just going to put it out there like this. No, they didn't. That is not humanly possible. Human beings are not objective. You cannot be taught to treat or to see everyone the same. And when you say that, you're indicating that you don't understand how socialization works, which is actually a positive thing in the sense that that can direct what you would need to focus on if you want to get deeper understanding. The other one I want to speak to is this common trope of, I don't care if you're pink, purple, polka dotted. If that's in your vocabulary, I would urge you to please drop it and never say it again. Although it isn't intentional, it's actually very demeaning. People don't come in those colors, and what it conveys is that you're not prepared to engage with authenticity. Okay? And that's why I have this image of a dock, right? That's very superficial surface. And for me, in trying to understand how all this works, what it means to be white, and live so separate by race, even though I was taught to see myself individually as open-minded and outside of all of this, I've had to go under the surface. And that's why I have this image here now of under the water. You see the pillars or posts that prop up the surface. Okay? So, for example, it's very common in discussions of race to have white people tell you about all the people of color in their lives, right? Oh, I have these coworkers, or my best friend, or my second cousin married a black man, or all of the ways that we want everyone to know that we have relationships with people of color. Okay? And so we're giving you evidence, right? When someone tells you that, they're giving you evidence. And so what are they giving you evidence of? They're giving you evidence that because they love people of color, know and love people of color, they can't be racist, which means they see racism as conscious dislike or explicit bias or hatred, right? And they're communicating to you that they don't have conscious dislike or hatred, as evidenced by all of these people in their lives. And what we don't understand is the power of implicit bias. Most bias is unconscious. And that makes it very, very dangerous because it drives our behaviors, but we're not aware of it. Yes, it's wonderful to have people of color in your life if you're white. Many, many, many white people don't have people of color in close relationships. But that doesn't mean your life is free of racism. That doesn't mean you don't have a white experience or a white perspective. And it also doesn't mean that racism will not surface in your relationships with people of color. So if we go underneath and we look at the pillars that are supporting that kind of superficial ways that we're taught to think about racism, we see individualism as a very powerful prop or support, this idea that each of us is unique and outside of socialization. We see universalism, which is kind of the opposite of individualism. Individualism says, why can't we all be different? And universalism says, why can't we all be the same? This is a very popular ideology in religious or faith communities. And I'm not arguing that on a deep spiritual level, we're not all universally the same, but we don't live, if you will, in the spiritual realm. We live in the physical realm. And here in the physical realm, we have to ask ourselves, how does it function to say we all bleed under the skin? Well, it functions to take race off the table, to take power off the table, to deny that we have fundamentally different experiences, because racism is real. And while race isn't real, in other words, at the biological level, there is no real, true race or racial difference as we're taught to understand it, these very superficial signifiers of racial difference that allow us to categorize people, these are very real in their consequences for people's lives. And this insistence that we're all one doesn't allow us to engage with that social reality. I try to help white people see how race functions in our lives. And I try to move us away from the really obvious, evident examples, such as a racist joke or a racist action, or things that would be recognizable to everybody, right? The kinds of acts that cause people like me, well-meaning people like me, to say, I couldn't possibly be racist, I don't do those things. And I try to help white people understand racism as the very fabric of our society. And I think the most profound example of everyday racism is segregation. That most white people live in racial segregation. While we may work with people of color, when we go home, people of color are rarely at our dinner table. And I don't mean setting our table. I mean sitting and breaking bread with us, true relationships in our lives. Many people can recognize the explicit, kind of conscious dislike type of racism, racist jokes, racist expressions, the KKK. But I want to help white people see the everyday racism that's embedded and that we participate in. And I want to look at neighborhood and school segregation as an example. I'm going to start with this app here. These are the app's founders. It's a new app called The Sketch Factor. And what it does is when you go to a new city, you can put in where you are, and it tells you which neighborhoods to avoid because they're sketchy. And of course, sketchy is very much associated with race and class in the white mind. And so now we have the convenience of segregation through an app. We don't actually have to talk to other white people about, where are the good neighborhoods and the bad neighborhoods. And that good neighborhood, good schools, bad schools discourse is an example of new racism. I don't think it gets by anybody that is racially coded language. So this way we can come out and police those racial boundaries without ever kind of naming race. But we all know what we're talking about. And I think the most profound way that my life has been shaped by my race is through the power of segregation. Most white people do live in segregation. We choose that segregation, and in a lot of ways we celebrate it. What makes a school good and what makes a neighborhood good? Well, the absence of people of color. That is the way that white people measure the value of their neighborhoods and schools. And while we don't come out and name that, we all know what it is. And so I have had to think very deeply on what it means to have grown up in a primarily white neighborhood, to be born into, to go to school, to study, to learn, to play, to worship, to love, to work, and to die in segregation, and not have one single person who loved, mentored, or guided me convey that there was any loss. And I'm going to repeat that because I think it's very profound and I really want us to sit with it. that I could live my whole life in segregation. In fact, if I follow the trajectory that my loving parents laid out for me in my good neighborhood and my good school and my good college and my good career, in which I would ideally rise to the top, I could easily never have any consistent, ongoing, authentic relationships with people of color, and not one person who guided me ever conveyed that there was loss. Just sit with that for a moment, that there is no inherent value in the perspectives or experiences of people of color. If my parents, if my schools, if my curriculum, if my teachers, if my government saw value in those perspectives, I would be given those perspectives. But I wasn't given those perspectives. And that shapes my relationships. It shapes what I care about. It shapes what I see, what I don't see, who I build my life with, and who I don't build my life with. And that is the level where we really need to look at race inside of us and with us. In the line of work that I do, it's a breakthrough if you can get white people to acknowledge that our race privileges us in this society, right? That is like the second coming, to get white folks to admit that we are privileged by our race. But even that begins to get superficial. And you'll hear white people say, just because of the color of my skin, you know, I have these things, as if this is just an accident that happens. And I want to take us deeper. I want to take us inside this skin. My psychosocial development was inculcated in the water of white supremacy. That is what I call this system. I don't mean the KKK. I mean a system in which whiteness and white people are central and seen as inherently superior to people of color. My personality was formed in that water. My worldview was formed in that water. I didn't choose it. It isn't my fault. I'm not racked with guilt about it, but I am responsible for changing it, because the default of our society is the reproduction of racism. It's built into every system and every institution. And if we just live our lives and carry on in the most comfortable ways for us, we will necessarily reproduce it. There is no neutral space. Inaction is a form of action. One of the most effective adaptations of racism since the civil rights era is this idea of a racist is a bad person, and if you're not racist, you're a good person. What I call the good-bad binary. And we can all fill it in, right? So if you're racist, then you're prejudiced and mean-spirited and bigoted and ignorant and Southern and probably drive a pickup truck. So we got some classism in there, right? This is our racist. And if you're not racist, you're good and you're progressive and you're open-minded and you're educated and you're northern. And this binary is probably the number one construct that keeps racism today in place and makes it nearly impossible to talk to white people about racism. The defensiveness we have comes from this binary. What we hear is, you just said I was a bad person. And so this binary sets it up to be mutually exclusive. You cannot be a good person and be complicit with racism. So you'll notice in the news when racism gets talked about, they'll bring in the evidence they'll have to defend the person that's being accused of racism is, but he's a really nice person. Right? Because again, it's mutually exclusive. We have to understand racism as a system that we're all a part of. You know, I often, in my trainings, after I've kind of laid out kind of how racism works, I'll ask people of color, how often have you given white people feedback on our inevitable, unaware and unintentional, but inevitable racism, and have that go well for you? And, you know, there's eye rolls and laughter, and basically the answer is never, right? It's virtually impossible for people of color to give us feedback because that binary sets us up to defend, right? I must, at all costs, deflect and establish that I am not racist, right? And that makes it so that we can't examine the reality of the society that we live in. And then I'll follow up and ask this question. So what would your daily life be like This is a question I ask the people of color. If you could simply give us feedback when we step in it, which we inevitably will, and have us receive that with grace, reflect, and seek to do something different, what would your daily life be like? And recently, a man of color in the room, there was a pause, and then he said, it would be revolutionary. And I just want you to sit with that for a minute. Revolutionary, that white people would receive the feedback, reflect, and try to change our behavior. That would be a revolution. And on the one hand, it speaks to how difficult we are, how powerful this binary is to keep us separate, from this system in our minds, but also how simple, and that there are material consequences, right, in heart rate and blood pressure and length of life for people of color, from the ways that would lower the kinds of stress that they have every day navigating all of this from us while we deny that anything's happening. Returning to the pillars underneath the dock, now we can label them, right? So we have individualism, we have universalism, right? Individualism, why can't we all be different? Universalism, why can't we all be the same? They both function to take race off the table. We have internalized superiority that no white person can miss. It was not lost on me that fundamentally it is better to be white. I don't want that belief. I didn't ask for that belief, and I've committed my life to challenging it. But 24/7, that is what society reinforces for me. So internalized superiority is also one of the pillars. The good-bad binary is a very foundational pillar holding up new racism. And segregation, the power of segregation to keep this system in place. And for me, by identifying those pillars, it has helped guide me to then how would I challenge each of those things. And so I urge you to take this journey. It is lifelong. It won't be over in my lifetime. I will never be free of all of the investments in this system that I have that I can't see, but I have committed my life to doing my very best to continually challenge it. And I invite you, and in fact, urge you to do the same.
All right, family. Thank you for tuning in. Let me stop this. To another episode of My Irreligious Life. I'm your host, Jermaine Thomas, aka the Professor. And I will be doing a presentation on Christian nationalism, whiteness, religion, and politics, and how they all intersect. And the person that you all were just listening to is a sociologist, Robin DiAngelo. She has a book called White Fragility, Why It's So Hard for White People to Talk About Racism. I don't know what's going on with my camera, but if you can hear me, that's great. Just keep following along with me until this thing clears up. I don't know what it is with this platform. I tried a different computer today, hoping that the camera output would be different. Maybe I need to change the camera settings. Let me see if no, it's on there by default. So hopefully this will clear up. I'm gonna go ahead and pivot to another video, just to paint the reality of whiteness. Okay, there we go. I think it cleared up. But anyway, if you can hear me, that's great. And if you come in, check in. Good morning. Say hi. I'm gonna pivot to this next video, and then I'm gonna come back and give some dialogue. I think there's two things I just wanted to do in this first part one is to talk about, give a working definition of whiteness, defer to the experts. And so I thought that Robin DiAngelo would be perfect to set at the beginning. I'm gonna play this other video. It gives examples to what we're talking about, and I do want to preference this: when we reference whiteness, we're not talking about a particular people group per se in that regard, right? We're talking about something that's a construct. We're talking something that's an ideology, if you will, that's institutionalized, and for some it's obvious, and to others it's not always that obvious. And I think Robin DiAngelo speaks to that perfectly on the onset of starting this video. So if you haven't had a chance to go back, when this ends, go back and read. And play that, and you can search her on YouTube, and her book is available as well, and I have a copy myself. So I'm gonna pivot to this other video, and then I'm gonna come back and give a brief little dialogue about what whiteness is and what whiteness is not, and then from there I'll set stage for coming videos and commentary of this sort. But this is part one, and I thank you for tracking with me. You're more than welcome to conversate there in the comment section. I would greatly appreciate that. So let me just cue this up, this next video. Going to share that. All right, I'm going to hide myself here in the back scenes. Let this play, and then I'll come back in, as I always say, land the plane. All right, thank you for tracking with me, and hold on and listen to this.
When Sanu Thadani Israni bought a house in this neighborhood in California's Silicon Valley, she found something disturbing in the fine print of her home deed.
The language that I read basically said the only people allowed to live in this community, in these homes, are white, unless you're a servant.
The subdivision is called Ladera, and the racist covenants were attached to the deeds of all 500-some homes here. The rules are no longer enforceable or even legal, but they've been on the books since the neighborhood was laid out 70 years ago. And they help illustrate how so many of America's suburbs ended up segregated.
It hurts. It hurts to be told you're not welcome. Forget welcome, you're not allowed.
It so offended me, I thought, well, this has to be offending everyone who buys property here.
Some of Ladera's residents set out to understand how this happened. And it turned out these relics of segregation grew out of a historical moment more often remembered for progressivism and inclusion.
I pledge myself to a new deal for the American people.
The New Deal programs launched between 1933 and the end of the Second World War transformed society. But Black Americans reaped far fewer benefits from these programs than white Americans.
The New Deal expanded government capacities in a way that provided economic rights for people. The right to capital, the right to a job, the right to health care, the right to old age pension. What was problematic is that that right was not inclusive.
One of the clearest examples of this came when New Deal agencies began insuring affordable home loans. Before backing the loans, agencies mapped communities across the country, dividing them into zones judged to be higher or lower risk for banks. Records show a key factor federal mapmakers used to determine this perceived risk was race. This practice, called redlining, largely cut people of color off from affordable borrowing.
It's not a case that you just had these bigoted bankers and these bigoted homeowners. The federal government was culpable. Black people, by design, were excluded from this benefit.
It's exactly what happened in Ladera. In the late 1940s, a mixed-race group of about 100 families banded together to build cheap homes near Stanford University. Workers, teachers, and professors, including the novelist Wallace Stegner, formed a cooperative to buy and transform attractive hilly ranch land into an affordable suburb named Ladera. But the project soon stalled.
No bank would give them the loan to build these homes. The banks wouldn't do it because the Federal Housing Administration wouldn't insure their loans, because of these 100 members of the cooperative, 3 were African Americans.
At the time, the Federal Housing Administration explicitly recommended that race restrictions be used in new suburban developments. Its lending manual even included instructions for banning buyers who weren't the race for which new homes were intended.
The segregation that this program alone created is responsible for much of the racial inequality we have in this country today.
Unable to find financing, the Ladera Cooperative disbanded and sold the land to a private developer who built Ladera as a whites-only community. By the 1950s, this mix of federal policy and private discrimination left few options for Black Americans seeking homes in this part of California.
My dad got involved with the Palo Alto Stanford branch of the NAACP. They were proving that there was housing discrimination. And it was notorious here, very subtle, but it was notorious. My dad could easily pass for white. My mom was brown-skinned. You knew who she was. It was actually something that was very painful for my mother, because my dad would go to rent an apartment or to buy property. They'd say, wonderful. He'd say, let me bring my wife. And as soon as she came back with him, they would say, no, this is no longer available.
When my parents came here from Alabama, they figured, okay, this is a nice area. We don't have to worry about our kids getting lynched. There's not open racism, but they didn't factor in that there was a slew of hidden racism.
About 9 miles from Ladera, Elwyn Rayner's family opened up this service station in one of the only areas open to Black American property buyers, now known as East Palo Alto.
The African Americans were guided to this area. Any houses on the other side of the freeway were considered to be out of their price range, or the interest rate alone would kill that dream of them owning a house because they couldn't afford it. It's like they say you're on the wrong side of the tracks. For us, it was the wrong side of the freeway.
For decades, East Palo Alto and neighboring Bellhaven were unincorporated communities without a city government, where housing shared space with heavy industry, and residents enjoyed few of the amenities available to the majority white suburbs, like Palo Alto, Menlo Park, or Ladera.
We had roads that were badly paved. We had many a neighborhood that did not have sidewalks. We had a school district that was grossly underfunded. We were walking in the middle of the street instead of walking on sidewalks. We had bad lighting. We had bad water. We didn't even have a city. We didn't have a place where we could go and complain even.
Today, East Palo Alto is 70% Black and Latino. The median family income is $83,000, half the household's rent, and more than 10% of families live in poverty. Compare this to Ladera, 75% white. The median family income stands just below $200,000. The poverty rate is 1%, and nobody rents.
And it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure that one out, what that's really all about.
What's it all about?
Well, it's about race.
What is critical to note is that a white, asset-based middle class didn't simply emerge. It was structured, and was structured largely through home ownership. It was structured largely through policy that facilitated white people to acquire homes that appreciated over their lifetime, that could be passed down to future generations as well.
The considerable gap in education and income between America's Black families and white families has slowly narrowed since the Civil Rights era. But the gap in wealth, what families own, has been a different story.
Throughout American history, the racial wealth gap has been dramatic. For every dollar held by a typical white family at the median, the typical black family has had about a dime. So this asset-based, wealth-based, white middle class that was generated from New Deal and post-war policies was never extended to black people.
And economists say one of the most significant factors creating the wealth gap between white and black Americans is home ownership. Much of a middle-class family's net worth is determined by the value of their home and whether you or your ancestors could buy one in the first place.
A home also facilitates your ability to generate wealth to do other things. You can finance an expensive college degree. With wealth, if you want to change jobs, you can pursue your dreams. A home provides access to neighborhood resources. A home provides access to, in the American context, with public schooling, good schools.
My father's family was a group of 7 that lived in one room. So when I look at the opportunities my children had by living in this neighborhood, function of purely geography, that zip code, it's a huge amount of privilege to have grown up in this neighborhood.
There's no quick fix for the inequality that's grown out of residential segregation. But researchers say it's worth considering what history can teach us.
The problems that exist today, what is important to note, they're not insurmountable. The New Deal was about jobs, it was about income, it was about pension, it was about health. There are certain enabling goods and services that people need in order to thrive. That's a reality. And just like government facilitated it in the past, they can facilitate it today, only this time they can do it in a way that is inclusive.
In the meantime, a group of volunteers in Ladera gathered enough signatures to formally strike the whites-only language from all 534 deeds in the subdivision.
We didn't have a statue of Robert E. Lee in our neighborhood, but we did have this. And we had the power to get rid of it.
And I would say that if the pendulum had to go from you are not allowed to taking them down, we now need to say you are welcome.
Now we need to say that you are welcome. I love that. Let me get rid of this. Alrighty. I hope something I share here via my post or these vlogs would empower you, encourage you, but more importantly, challenge you to think. All right. And the video was playing in the background. Sorry about that. So I'm going to break down. I put this post up on Facebook, so it's there. You can check it out. What is whiteness and what whiteness is not. And then it have some source material that you can go back and read to get a substantive understanding. Again, this speaks of a system more so does it does a people group. And so I don't want people to get up in arms and say, oh, oh, they're talking about they're racist, they're being racist. Let me just share this caveat. I was thinking about this a lot, and how I would unpack this series of conversations. And one of the things, and I'll get into that. But again, with the larger theme here is we're talking about Christian nationalism, but I think it's important for us to have a concrete understanding of what whiteness is and what it's not, and to see examples of the systematic impact of such of this of the reality of this construct. Okay, and so we showed this is in California, right, far removed from the South, the segregated South. This is California, right? The place of the birthplace of the liberal movement, right? With some aspect of it, but yet one of the key words the brother said, it was hidden racism. You know, we can deal with the obvious, and I think the obvious is the obvious, right? When it comes to racism today, but then there is the aspects of racism that's hidden, and I think Well, I don't think Robin DiAngelo, the video on the onset speaks to that. This video about, the contracts, right, with these home deeds, that basically is whites only, right? And I love how this community band together to get that language out of those decrees associated with buying land in this particular region in California. I love that. We need to see more of that, and I think D'Angelo, she hinted at that. But when you think of the notion of proximity to power, and in that context, it becomes impossible for Black people to be quote unquote racist, prejudicial, discriminatory. Arguably, yes, maybe, but it takes power, distinct power, and those that benefit from it. And D'Angelo spelled it out at in this nation's inception, right? White men and ideals that speak to preserving their idea and notion of power. That's the birthplace of this idea. That's the birthplace of this construct. And every system that was created to benefit the growing, emerging American society within our nation historically did not include indigenous people, and it didn't include people of color. We had to fight for that, and that's hence the reason we had the civil rights movement. Okay, to, I guess you could say, to right wrongs, and we're still righting those wrongs. Today, we're still feeling the impact. There's still the wealth gap racially, so there's still some disparities that's there, that you can look at systematically. You can take a scientific method model and look at these institutions and systems, right? Whether it's housing, whether it's particular policies and how policies are framed and shaped. The welfare policy. Look at the history of welfare policy. And so this is the other part of why I say Christian nationalism, whiteness, politics, and religion. And we'll get into the religion part of things soon, because you can't talk about Christian nationalism without talking about these subsets. And so I hope to give you working definitions, data research relative to these aspects of whiteness, religion, and whiteness, and how they all intersect, right? And how and why we need to be aware of these things. And so this is not an attack, assault on white people. This is dealing with an ideology and a concept that's pervasive and that's systematic in our society. And so I know there's conversations that, for years, even when I was in Christian circles, there was always conversations and talks about racial reconciliation. And you already heard Robin say and break down why it's very hard and difficult for white people to talk about racism and the binary ideas that's often associated with that when it comes to conversations around race and racism. And so it is not incumbent upon people who have been oppressed, right, systematically, and it's proven, it's evidentiary, to have to make the concerted effort to bring some sense of reconciliation when we were the receiving party of much of the oppression than any other people group. So when we talk about racial reconciliation, foundationally, is going to take for white people to feel comfortable talking about racism. Hence, we have the response, the tools, the mechanisms, diversity, inclusion, equity, and inclusion paradigms in critical race theory to take a more substantive lens. And like D'Angelo in the video, she talks about the peer, right? the floating pier. Oftentimes we take things at the surface. No, you got to dig and go deeper. In critical race theory and other theories that uh, give give life to the reality of the harm, the impact of institutional whiteness, or systematic systems of oppression and racism, right? It gives us a lens, a working lens to help us go in and unpack these things and deconstruct these things. And so without doing that, there can never be racial reconciliation. I don't care how much prayer, God, you put in that. There has to be some real introspection. And that's not our job to help um, them do that. Okay. So that's that. And that's my little rant there. Let me read this and then I end this live. And I appreciate you tracking with me. And again, I hope something I share here today would empower you, encourage you, but more importantly, challenge you to think. All right. So listen to this. What whiteness is? Whiteness is not a fixed biology category, but a socially constructed identity tied to power dynamics, privilege, and historical processes. It emerged as a way to categorize people of European descent in contrast to non European others, particularly during colonial and slavery eras. And so we're going to stick with this track of whiteness, you all, even in part two, and then get over into the politics of it. And I give examples. So stay tuned for the next part two. And I hope to do that maybe next week, Sunday. All right. But listen, examples. Scholars like David and Toni Morrison argue whiteness was constructed in the U.S. to unify diverse European immigrant groups, Irish, for example, Irish, Italians, and under a shared identity to maintain racial hierarchies. Okay. A system of privilege. Whiteness often functions as an unmarked or default racial category that grants social, economic, and political advantages, i.e., for example, the properties in all white suburbs, and then in the fine print, do not rent, or do not sell these homes to people of color or non-whites, consciously or unconsciously, those identified as white. Examples: studies like Peggy's McIntosh, White Privilege, Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack, 1988, highlight how whiteness can confer unearned benefits, such as an easier access to jobs or less scrutiny in public spaces. We can give an example of that is racial profiling. Okay. I like to, throw out things to get people to think at times. And so, for example, when you think about privilege, and the notion of privilege relative to race, I ask, people, I say, when was the last time you heard a white person have conversations and express concerns about sundown towns? And more than likely, the person that may have that conversation may be a biracial person that may present uh, more African American than they do white. Um, but a white person having that conversation and expression and concern about a sundown town, just outright, that's privilege. That's an example of privilege. Um, when was the last time you heard white parents happen to have conversations with their child out of concern of being profiled? And not just the conversation of profile, but then how to address law enforcement when they are being profiled, given the concerns there with overuse of force when it comes to people of color. So um, that type of conversation escapes them. They don't have to have that conversation, right? And so that again is another example of privilege when it comes to a person's color and or race. And so I just set those out to get us something to think about. But let me just continue with my list. Um, a cultural and historical identity. Whiteness is shaped by cultural norms, values, and histories that vary by region and time. It often emphasizes traits like individualism, meritocracy in Western context, though those are not inclusive to white people. Example, in the US, whiteness has been tied to idealized images of suburban life, media representation that center white experiences. And so all you have to do is go back to old commercials, that didn't necessarily speak to the economics of black and brown people. It was more so catering to the dominant culture. Um, and then you can look at my lens. You can look at the write out here. Let me just go here and jump to what whiteness is not. It's not a monolith. Whiteness is not a singular uniform identity. It varies across class, gender, nationality, and culture. For example, a poor white person in the rural Appalachias does not experience whiteness the same way as affluent white persons in urban centers. Example, class based analysis show that whiteness does not guarantee economic success, though it may still confer relative advantages. Whiteness is not inherently evil or malicious. Whiteness as a social category is not synonymous with individual prejudices or malice. It's a structural phenomenon, not a personal failing of every white person. Example, many white individuals actively work against racism, yet still exist within systems shaped by whiteness. Okay, whiteness is not equivalent to being white. Being a white person in terms of racial classification is not the same as actively embodying of upholding whiteness as an ideology or system of dominance. Example, a white person may reject white supremacist ideologies but still benefit from systematic advantages tied to whiteness. Okay. Whiteness is not a biological essence, meaning whiteness is not rooted, inherent to genetic traits or superiority. It is a historical and social category, not a scientific one or biological one for that matter. Okay. So, okay, this is important. Whiteness is not universal across cultures. Whiteness is not a global consistent category. In non-Western contexts, racial dynamics may prioritize other identities as caste or ethnicity over whiteness. All right. So again, you can find that on my page to what whiteness is and what whiteness is not. All right, so this will conclude part one of exploring Christian nationalism here in America. And I want to give us a working definition of whiteness and what that is and what it is not. So that, moving forward, when I get into the bigger picture and how it all intersect and tie into Christian nationalism, you'll be more conscious aware of what's happening present day in our society, have more of a discernment, if you will, to hidden racism, microaggression, the microaggression of racism, how to distinguish these things, how to educate and empower, and to our white allies out there, for you to continue to have the conversation and to continue to challenge this paradigm and this ideology of whiteness within our society. In the working hand in hand, right, to continue to, despite those in our society today that don't want to have the conversation, that would rather whitewash history, America's history, than to deal with the systematic evidentiary aspects that's still present within our society, you all. And so it's important that we continue to have this conversation. It's important that we continue to have this dialogue. And I encourage pastors and faith spaces to have this conversation and dialogue with your members, and especially in Black and African American faith spaces. But we all can take and do our part relative to this in dismantling these types of systems and ideology, that still perpetuate systems of oppression that's still being felt today. So again, I hope something I shared today would empower you, encourage you, but more importantly, challenge you to think. Check me out next week as we dive into part 2 of this subject of Christian nationalism. All right. God bless you. And thank you for tuning in. Bye.